Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding the Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we'll be learning today Mitzvah Hashem Daf Samach Tes Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin and we pick up today at the bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch on Samach Tes Amud Beis with a brand new Siman Mem Din Eich Linhoig B'Kedushas HaTefillin, the halachas of how one is supposed to act in accordance with the Kedusha, the sanctity of Tefillin. How do you have to treat the Tefillin with due respect? Uboy ches seifim, and here we have 8 seifim. Says the Mechaber in Sif Aleph, Aser litlois tefillin. You are not allowed to hang your tefillin. Bein babatim, bein beritzuos. Whether you're hanging them so that the batim are hanging down, the Mishnah Berurah says that's what it means, bein babatim, or bein beritzuos, or whether you have the straps hanging down. Aval mutar litlaisan bekisan, but you're allowed to hang them when they are in their kiss, in their bag. You can see I'm taking out my pair of tefillin over here just for illustrative purposes. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says Aser litlais, Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Aleph here on Samach Tes Amud Beis. Aser litlais, you're not allowed to hang the tefillin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what does that mean? Al hayaseid. You're not allowed to hang them on a peg. Memneishu derech bezoyin, because that would be a derech bezoyin. What does that mean? Well, imagine you're in shul and the shul has pegs. They have hat hooks on the wall. So somebody wants to come and he wants to take his shel rosh and hang it on the hook and hang the tefillin hanging like that with the kesher up here on the hook and the bias down. Obviously, that's a derech bezoyin. Imagine you walk into shul and you see a bunch of shel roshes hanging like that from a peg. Says the Mechaber, also litleis tefillin, bein babatim, bein beritzuos. So the Mishnah Berurah said on a peg. Eis Katan Beis, bein babatim. What does that mean that it's also to do it whether, you see, I think most people would automatically translate the Mechaber. They would say bein babatim means whether they're hanging it from the bias, that means that the bias is up on the peg, bein beritzuos, or they're hanging it from the straps, so that the straps are on the peg and the bias is hanging down. The Mishnah Berurah says that that's not the proper way to translate it. The Mishnah Berurah says bein babatim means shahabatim tluyos lamata. When the Mechaber says that you're not allowed to hang them bein babatim, he means with the bottom hanging down. Ubein charitzuos tluyos lamata, or if the ritzuos are hanging down. Either way, you're not allowed to do it. Nevertheless, having said this halacha, that you're not allowed to hang the tefillin, says the Mishnah Berurah, and he brings this down, I believe, yes, from the Magen Avram, ba'akroi ba'alma, if you do it just kind of like by happenstance, in other words, quickly, she'oichiz a tefillin biyadoi, so that you're holding the tefillin in your hands, v'haritzuyos tuluyos lamata, and the ritzuos are hanging down, ein lahakbid. You don't have to be makbid. In other words, you finished davening, you took off your tefillin. Now you're going to take your tefillin and you're going to wrap them up. So what do? You hold the bias and you grab your case, right? And you go to put the bias in the case. Where are the ritzuos? Oh, the ritzuos are hanging down. Is this called that I'm being toiler my tefillin because I'm holding the bias and I'm hanging the tefillin down? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, that's not a problem. If you happen to be holding the bias, and the ritzuos are hanging down, you don't have to be makbid on that. The problem over here is derech bezoyin, to go hang up the tefillin. But if you're holding the tefillin by the bias, you're holding them properly, you're holding them carefully, and the ritzuos are hanging down because you need to put them away, or you need to handle the tefillin for whatever reason, that you don't have to be makbid on. But, continues the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, Aval, however, im ha-tefillin tluyin, if you're doing it the other way, let's say you took off your tefillin, and now you're going, you realized you left your tefillin bartel and your cases by the other table. So you're walking over to the other table to get your case to put away your tefillin. So you want to walk down through the shul holding your tefillin like this, holding the ritzuas and hanging the bottom down. No. That's derech bezoyin. And that the Mishnah Berurah says, avalim at-tefillin teluyin, if you're hanging the bias, the tefillin, down, also b'chol gavni. That's always usher, even if you're doing it ba'akroi. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, ve'ein b'chlal zeh, but it is not included in this isser, masha tefillin shel roish tolui ba'avir, when the tefillin of the shel roish are hanging in the ear, umachzikin biyad b'ritzuos, and you're holding on to the ritzuos, umesimim ala roish, when you're putting the tefillin on. In other words, you took out your shel roish, you're going to put your shel roish on. So you go like this, and you bring it up to your head. What's happening right now? The bias is hanging down, and I'm holding the ritzua until I actually get it onto my head. So are you going to tell me that that's an isser? So the truth is that a lot of people, the way they put on their shel roish is like this. They hold the shel roish, and they go like this. They go over their head like this. They're always keeping the bias up, and they put it on like this. That's the way a lot of people put on their tefillin. And you'll tell me that, oh, so this fellow, he never hung his tefillin. Masha ain't kain, if you put on your tefillin the way I showed you, if you go like this, right? So then you were guilty of hanging your tefillin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, it's not a problem. Ve'ein b'chlal zeh. And if you look at the Sharitzion as cotton bays, he brings this down from the Taz and the Pri Megadim. Ve'ein b'chlal zeh. It is not included in this isser, masha tefillin shel roish tolui ba'avir, when the tefillin shel roish is hanging in the ear, umachzikin biyad b'ritzuos, and you're holding on with your hands to the ritzuos, umasimam ala roish, and you're putting the tefillin onto your head, kizeu tzarech hanachosam, because that's a tzarech of putting on the tefillin. Now, I will tell you that when I put on my tefillin, I take my shel roish out of the case, I kiss the kesher, I kiss the bias, then I do this. I go like this, and I line up the kesher opposite the bias, because I want that when I put it on, the kesher is going to be at the nape of my neck by the bone, and the bias is going to be centered, beinei neck on my forehead, up over here, and that way, so the kesher and the bias are directly opposite each other. I line them up, and then I go like this, and then I put them on. So I once had somebody in shul come over to me and say, oh, Asher Litle's tefillin, you're not allowed to hang your tefillin. So the first thing I did was I showed him this Mishnah Berurah. I said, I'm sorry, but this is, the Mishnah Berurah says beferish, that this is not a problem. Second thing I told him was, be'enai royeh. I saw with my own two eyes that the way I just showed you that I put on my tefillin, that's the way Rav Moshe Zechet Tzaddik V'Kadosh L'Vracha put on his tefillin. So it's not a problem of hanging the tefillin. Finally, the Mishnah Berurah says over here, a nice cotton bays, v'yesh manichen ashal roish al hadaf v'chedoyma b'shashal loivshin. I don't know exactly what this means. It sounds like there were people who what they would do is they would put the bias up on a shelf and then come up to the shelf and do this, so that again it was never hanging. That's what it sounds like to me. He says there are those that do that. He doesn't seem to. Certainly doesn't say that you have to do that. Maybe he's just saying that there is an eitzah. If you don't want to hang the bias even for a second, you could do such a thing. Ois Cotton Gimel, the Mechaber said, Mutter litloisan bekisan. You're allowed to hang the tefillin when they're in their kiss. So nowadays you have a lot of bachurim who have a tefillin bag, or adults also. They have the talus bag inside the bag that has a shoulder strap. Are you allowed to hang the bag? Are you allowed to take the bag and hang it up by its strap on a peg? That the Mechaber says yes. Mutter l'tloisan bekisan. When the tefillin are in their bag, you could hang up the bag. That, he says, is not a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Gimel. He draws a distinction between tefillin and a Sefer Torah. The Sefer Torah also l'tloisa b'chal gavni. You're never allowed to hang a Sefer Torah. Afilu kishihi ba'aron hakodesh. Even if you have some kind of an aron hakodesh. Think about one of these little small portable aronim that they use, let's say, in a shiva house. So they have a small Sefer Torah. Maybe they even have a small Sefer Torah in a small aron. So imagine you take one of those small aronos and you'll take it and you'll screw it to the wall. So now there's nothing underneath the aron. The aron is hanging on the wall. You fastened the aron kodesh to the wall. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're not allowed to do that. Afilu kishihi b'aron hakodesh, even if you put a Sefer Torah in an aron kodesh, v'toila ha'aron kodesh, and you hang the aron kodesh, you're not allowed to do that. V'ayin b'chayodam klal amid aleph shekosav da'afilu kisharon hakodesh b'chuber b'yeseidos l'kaisel. Even if you're not hanging the Aron HaKodesh. In other words, in the first case, it's not that you fastened the Aron HaKodesh to the wall. Imagine on the back of the Aron HaKodesh there's an eye, and you hang the Aron HaKodesh from a hook. So that the Mishnah Berurah said you're not allowed to do. Now he's saying an even bigger chiddush from the Chai Yodam. He says you're not allowed to hang it. Afilu kisharon hakodesh b'chuber b'yeseidos l'kaisel. Even if you'll nail or screw the Aron HaKodesh directly to the wall. Aser kol she'ein tachtav oimid davar ma. There has to be something underneath the Aron HaKodesh. You're not allowed to just hang the Aron HaKodesh. With Sfarim, how about Sifra? Sfarim, a Gemara. Very interesting halacha. With Sfarim, kikoyin Sifrei Talmud, a Gemara. V'chadoima, doima l'tfillin. They have the same halacha as a tefillin that we learned here. You're not allowed to hang a Gemara. You're not allowed to hang a Gemara on a hook. Let's say you have a Gemara and you drilled through the cover and you made a nice silver chain and you want to hang it up. Also, you're not allowed to do that. By the tefillin, we said if you put the tefillin in a bag, then you're allowed to hang the bag. So now he's saying like this. You have a Gemara. The Gemara has a cover. The cover has a hole in it. You put a chain through the cover. Are you allowed to hang it on a peg? Is that similar to tefillin that are in a bag? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. The covers of the Sfarim are not the equivalent of the bag of the tefillin. Because the cover is attached to the sefer. The cover is like the siddur. The cover is like the Gemara. So if you go and you hang it by a chain, you're hanging the siddur, you're hanging the Gemara. Not allowed to do that. Now he gives a heter in another case. Says the Mishnah Berurah here on Samach Tes Amud Aleph, Mutter lichtov psukim binyar. You're allowed to write psukim on a paper, v'letloisan b'pesach beis hakneses, and hang them on the door of the shul. So, for example, like it's brought down in Sfarim, somebody wants to write Za'ashar Lashem Tzadikim Yavoyu Voi, and he wants to hang that over the door of the shul. Pischuli Sharei Tzedek Avoy Vam Oideka. Right? He wants to hang it up on the door of the shul. Is that a problem of hanging Divrei Torah? You're taking a paper, you're putting a pasuk on it, you're hanging it by scotch tape. Are you allowed to do that? Or is that like hanging a sefer? So he says that you're allowed to do. And he brings this down from the Magen Avraham and the Pri Megadim, and I believe the reason for this is because those psukim, that's what they were made for. It's not a sefer that now you're going and hanging. It's a plaque. It's a sign that you made with the intent to hang it up. That you're allowed to do. That's not a bizoyin. That's what it was made for. Now, Hagam Olam develt is noig lehisanois to fast kishenofel tefillin miyadoi ala oretz beloy nartikon. If the tefillin fall out of your hand and they fall to the ground, so then the minig of the velt is to fast. Now, Now, I want to be medayik over here. It says over here that the minig is lehisanis kishenoifel tefillin miyadoi. If you dropped the tefillin, then there's a minig to fast. Why is there a minig to fast? So it's brought down. The reason is because it's a siman ra for the person, and this is based on a Gemara about. It's a Gemara in Moed Katan, but I forgot about who. That says that the ritzuas of his tefillin got flipped over and he fasted. Why? Because it's a siman ra. Something went awry with the tefillin. Remember what we said about tefillin. When you put on tefillin, you're being medabek your guf with the Shechina. You're attaching your guf to the Shechina. Ki Shem Hashem nikra alecha. The Shem Hashem is on you. And what's the name of Hashem on the tefillin? The Shem Shakai. Shedai be'elokusi l'chol beria. There's sufficient in the kedusha of the Rebbeinu Shalom, in the Shem of Hashem, to fill you up. So when you put on tefillin, you're attaching yourself to the Shem Hashem, and you're like I always quote from my Rebbe, the tefillin goes into your mind and into your bloodstream. You become imbued with the kedusha of the tefillin. So it's almost like you and the tefillin chadhu. You're uniting yourself with the tefillin and the Shem Hashem. If something goes awry with your tefillin, that's a siman ra for the person. So you fast. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there's a minute to fast, even if chas v'chalila Sefer Torah falls, even if the Sefer Torah is in its mantle, in its bag. Still, there's a minute to fast. By a Sefer Torah, there's a difference between a Sefer Torah and tefillin. By a tefillin, the minig is if it falls out of your hand. But if two people are in shul, Ruvain and Shimon, and Ruvain drops his tefillin to the floor, Ruvain fasts, Shimon does not fast, even if Shimon witnessed the tefillin falling down. By a Sefer Torah, the minig is that anybody who witnessed the Sefer Torah fall fasts. Vayin bel Yerabah shekasav dafilu tefillin ben artikan yiten pruta l'tzedakah. The El Yerabah says that even if the tefillin were in their bag when they fell, there's still a minig to give tzedakah. Okay, says the Mechaber Sif Bey's top line in the Shulchan Aruch, Samach Tes Amud Aleph. Bayis sheyesh by tefillin. Literally, this means a house where there are tefillin in the house. However, that's not what it means. It means a room. Bayis over here means a room, not a house. So, a room that has tefillin in it. Also, l'shamish by mitasai. You're not allowed to have marital relations in that room. Ad sheyotziem, until you remove the tefillin from that room. Oy sheyanichem bekli toich kli. Or if the tefillin are in a double covering. But we have to see what a double covering means. A double covering does not mean the plastic case that the tefillin are in and the tefillin bag. Probably doesn't even mean the outer plastic bag either. But let's take a look. So the tefillin have to be either removed from the room or they have to be in a double covering. For who? She'ein hasheni miyuchad lahem. The second covering or the first covering, but one of the coverings have to be a covering that's not miyuchad for the tefillin. It has to be a covering that was not made for the tefillin. It has to be something external to the tefillin, and the Mishnah Berurah will go into this. She'imu miyuchad, because if both coverings are miyuchad for the tefillin, then afilu mea chashuvim kechad. Then even if you have 100 coverings, it's considered one covering, because all of those coverings are miyuchad for the tefillin. When we say that the tefillin have to be in a double covering, it has to be, let's say, one covering that's miyuchad for the tefillin. So let's say you have the tefillin, and the tefillin are in the tefillin bag. Okay, so that's one covering. Then you have to have, let's say, a sheet that you cover over the tefillin. Now the sheet is not miyuchad l'tefillin. So now you have one covering that's miyuchad for the tefillin, and you have a second covering that's something external to the tefillin. It's a sheet. You covered it over with a sheet. So now you have a double covering, one of which is not miyuchad for tefillin. But if all the coverings are miyuchad for the tefillin, then it's all like one covering, and that's not sufficient for something that would be seen as treating the tefillin with a lack of respect. Marital relations is not something that you do in front of something respectful like a tefillin. It's dvarim shebetzina. It's something that's private. It's not something that belongs being done in front of tefillin. Not that it's something shameful. It's not shameful. It's a mitzvah. It's an inyan of kedusha done properly with the proper machshavos and everything else. It's kedusha. It's not shameful. We don't believe like the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, they treat the marital act as something with pritzus. They deal with it and they treat it as something which taka is shameful, an animalistic act. But in Torah, in halacha, It's, what do you mean? It's the first mitzvah. Open up the chinuch. Pur revu. It's the very first mitzvah. So it's not something shameful at all, but it is private. It is personal. It's not something that you do in front of somebody else. It's not something that you do. So that's not something that you do in front of tefillin. So the tefillin have to be covered. Says the Ramah Haggah, V'im shnehem einam yuchadim lahem, if both coverings are not miyuchad for the tefillin, oisha pnimi einam miyuchad lahem, or let's say the first covering, the inner covering, is not miyuchad, the hachitzayin miyuchad lahem, and the outer one is miyuchad for the tefillin, mutter, that's mutter. The Ramah is coming to really explain what the Mechaber said. You see, when you look at the Mechaber says that you need a kli b'sayich kli. You need a keli inside another keli. V'hu she'ein hasheni miyuchad lehem. And the second one cannot be miyuchad. So it sounds like the outer covering has to be a covering that's not miyuchad. It sounds almost like that the first covering, the inner covering, has to be miyuchad, and the outer covering has to be eina miyuchad. Comes the Ramah says, no, don't take the language of the Mechaber as dafka. The Mechaber is lav dafka. Both coverings could be einoi miyuchad, or the inner one could be einoi miyuchad, and the outer one could be miyuchad. All of that is okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Daled. The Mechaber said this halacha in the context of tefillin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'hu adin chumashim, the same halacha applies to a chumash, oy sidurei tefillos, or to sidurim, oy shar svarim, or other svarim, gemaras, kitzur shulchan aruchs, bein b'ksiva, whether those svarim are handwritten, oy b'tfus, or if they're printed, hakoil yesh bahem kedusha. All of these svarim are dvarim shebekedusha. Ubeinan kli toich kli, and you have to have a situation where there is a double covering over that sefer. Va'afilu im hein ksav mishita, even if the print or the writing is not the type of ashuris that we would write in a sefer Torah, it's a ksav mishita. Hainu she'eno ksiva stam v'urak ksav ashuri. It is ashuri, but not with the exact form that we would use in Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzahs. Furthermore, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ukrichas HaSefer, the binding of the Sefer, the cover, Eina Nechsheves L'Kisui. That's not one covering. Tehimi Gof HaSefer. That's part of the Sefer. Ubi'inan Oid Shnei Kisuyin. You need a double covering besides that. Vayin b'yaredei b'siman reish ayin alef b'tal sham sivkat ches shekasav writes kol hamekel b'kedusha svarim hanitfasin. Anybody who's a mekel on the kedusha of printed svarim asid litein hadin the tfus hevi k'may ksiva, because the din of print is the same as the din of handwritten. Ach b'tshuvas chavis yaris siman kof beidalid noita lahakel b'zeh b'shas adchak ki she'ein loy b'melech chasais. Ois cotton hay. The Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber said this halacha in the context of marital relations. You're not allowed to be mishamish mitasai oilasais tzrachav, or to fulfill one's bodily needs. Go to use the facilities. You can't do it in a room with his tefillin. Unless you remove the tefillin b'cheder acher into a different room. Or you put up a mechitza that's 10 tfachim tall. The Magen Avram Sif Katan Tezvav, where the Magen Avram discusses the halacha if one of the coverings is somewhat see-through, like lace or something like that. He's mitzaded that you could be mekel. Ois Katan Zayin B'kli Toich Kli Lav Dafke Kalim. The Mishnah Berurah says the language of the Mechaber, a keli toich keli. It sounds like you need a box, one box inside another box. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, we don't need kalim. Duadin shnei kisuyin. 2 covers is enough. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'imperas talis oishar kisoy ala kis shel tefillin. Let's say you have tefillin in a bag, and now you put a towel over them or a sheet over them. Afal pisha kisoy ein mechasa rak lamaylu min atstadin. That sheet is covering the top of the tefillin bag and the sides of the tefillin bag. You're not wrapping it; it's not going underneath. So underneath, you don't have a double covering. V'loy lamata. Afilu achishari, that's enough. Vayin b'bir halacha. Let's say you do what most of us do, which is you have the tefillin bag inside the talis bag, together with the talis. Then haregama kis hagadol nikra kilyon hamiyuchadlen. The talis bag is not a second covering over the tefillin, because since you always put the tefillin bag into the talis bag, so the talis bag is considered a bag that's miyuchad for the tefillin. So you only have two coverings that are both miyuchad for the tefillin. V'tzarich oid kisei al gaban, so you still need a second covering. But now he says something ingenious. Im loisha mechase betalis ala tefillin. Oh, if you put your tefillin in the tefillin bag, and then you put the tefillin in the talis bag, and then you put the talis over the tefillin, now the talis is a second covering over the tefillin bag. Da'ar shari, that talis einon kilyon. Even though you always put the tefillin bag under the talis, you're not putting the tefillin bag under the talis because you're using the talis to protect the tefillin. No, you're not being miyached the talis for the purposes of the tefillin. Why do you put the tefillin under the talis bag? Because of a halacha that we learned, when you open up the talis bag, you want to be pageya in the talis first, because you don't want to be over on ein ma'avir and ala mitzvahs. You don't want to come to the tefillin first, because then you have to put the tefillin on before the talis, and we don't want to do that. But you're not putting the tefillin bag under the talis because you're being miyached the talis as a covering for the tefillin. So you have the tefillin in the tefillin bag. That's one covering. The tefillin bag is miyuchad for the tefillin. Then you have it covered over by the talis. That's a kisui. That's not considered miyuchad for the tefillin. That's your second covering, even though the talis bag is not a second covering. V'hu adin, and now he has an interesting case, and I think I interpreted this properly. V'hu adin, im kis ha-tefillin mechuber l'mayla al ha-kis ha-gadol. Let's say you have a case, very interesting. You bought a talis bag, and instead of having two independent bags, you don't have a little tefillin bag and then a big talis bag, and you put the little tefillin bag inside the big talis bag. No. What you have is, you have a big talis bag, and sewn into it, you have a small talis bag. So it's attached inside the talis bag. Now, in the illustration that the Mishnah Berurah gives, the words that he uses are that the kis ha-tefillin, the small tefillin bag, is mechuber lamayla. At its top, it's sewed al ha-kis ha-gadol to the big bag. Harei tzad hasheni shel kis ha-gadol ein nikra kilyan umoya lehen im hafachan. What he's saying is like this. If you have two separate bags, so you always take the tefillin bag and you always put it into the talis bag. So now the entire talis bag is considered a bag that's miyuchad for the tefillin. But let's say what you have is, I'm going to use a little different terminology than the Mishnah Berurah. Let's say you have a big bag, and the little tefillin bag is sewn onto the inner right side of the talis bag. So is the left side of the talis bag considered miyuchad for the tefillin? No. The tefillin never, ever, ever, ever go in the left side of the talis bag, because the little tefillin bag is sewn onto the right side of the talis bag. Oh. So now the left side of the talis bag is not a kli that's miyuchad for the tefillin. So if you fold it over on top of the right side, it's a second covering on the right side. He's saying a little different. He's saying that the tefillin bag is sewn to the top, to the inner top of the talis bag. So that part, the outer top, is miyuchad to protect the tefillin bag. But if I flip it over, now I'm using the bottom of the talis bag. The bottom of the talis bag is not miyuchad for the tefillin bag. Okay. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, V'ayin b'bir halacha ma'aseh kasafti b'shem el Yerabah. Kasav Magen Avram, the Magen Avram says, Tuhadin b'mezuzah hakfua lifnim b'cheder. This is a problem. I've seen this problem. Sometimes you have a situation where the mezuzah is on the inside of the door. So when you close the door to the bedroom, the mezuzah is on the inside of the door, not on the outside of the door. Tzarich kli b'say kli. The mezuzah has to be in a double covering. Otherwise, you can't have marital relations in that room. You have to cover the mezuzah with two coverings. Come on. And one of those coverings has to be not meyuchad for the mezuzah. So don't tell me that the saran wrap or the wax paper is one covering and the mezuzah case is another covering. No, they're both meyuchad for the mezuzah. And if one of the coverings is glass, even though you could see the mezuzah, that's one kisui. If you put a cloth over the mezuzah, so now you can't see it, that's two coverings. If you have the mezuzah in saran wrap, and then you have the mezuzah in a glass case, and now you want to put a second sheet of glass in front of it, even though the second sheet of glass is not meyuchad, that's not two coverings because everything is transparent. The ha-mezuzah nireis b'toichan. Kasar b'chachmas adam, the chachmas adam writes, nearly it seems to me, the bein b'mezuzah ishar svarim. Im asa mitchila shnei kelim, sheyichashev echad lekli b'sayt kli. Let's say you originally make it, right? So you have a mezuzah, and you know that your mezuzah is going to have to be inside the room. So you go ahead and you craft a mezuzah case, and you craft a second mezuzah case for the first mezuzah case to go in. So you made this mitchila for the mezuzah. You made both cases for the mezuzah, but you did it with the intent that the outer one should make it keli b'sayich keli. He says that's okay. Kigoyin shekarach ha-mezuzah b'nyar. You wrap the mezuzah in paper, and then you put it in a bag, mutter. Since your original machshava, your intent was that the outside covering should make it keli beside keli, even though you made it for the mezuzah, that's not a problem, that it's a keli miyuchad l'mezuzah. V'yeser kol adina bazeh nevar l'kamam b'siman reish mem be'ezus Hashem yisparach. Oiv kat ches she'ein hasheni. This is going on the mechaber. The mechaber said if that the requirement is that at least the second keli has to not be meyuchad for the tefillin. Says the Mishnah Berurah what the Ramah essentially says. Lav dafka. The wording of the mechaber is lav dafka. It's not precise. Let's say the first covering, the inner covering, is something which is not meyuchad. Let's say you have your tefillin in a tefillin bag, right? So right now you have a problem because you don't have a double covering. So what you do is you take out the tefillin out of the tefillin bag, you put the tefillin in a shopping bag, you wrap them up tight, and then you put them back inside the tefillin bag. So now the inner covering, the shopping bag, is einoi meyuchad, and the outer covering, the tefillin bag, is meyuchad. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's fine. You put it in a double shopping bag. Ve'enoi aser kli b'sayich kli rakim shnei miyuchadim. Aval me'echad ein miyuchad b'starfim miyuchad v'shari. V'hagah loy bar rak lefarish divrei mechaber d'loy nita b'lishnei. The Hagah, the Ramah, is only coming to explain the mechaber so that we should not make a mistake. Ukli echad afilu ein miyuchad loy mahani v'aser. But one keli, even if it's not miyuchad, is not enough. You need a double keli. I would like to point out, just before we finish the shir over here, I would like to point out that I have found that this is often a problem in people's houses, especially people who have young married couples. They have rooms in their house that they use to put up the marrieds. Now, very often, those rooms used to be older children's bedrooms. Then the family got older, the kids got married, they moved out. Now they come for Yom Tov, and they're moving into those rooms. Very often those rooms have svarim shranken, and they have svarim in them. And the parents never redecorated the rooms, so the svarim shranken are still in there. And now they're putting a young married couple into a room for Shabbos or for Yom Tov with svarim, sifrei kedusha. You know, what if the couple, right? What if the couple, they're a married couple, right? What if they're going to engage in marital relations? It's the Friday night, Einig Shabbos, Einig Yom Tov. Right, you're putting them into a very uncomfortable position because you're putting them up in a way where they can't, because there's svarim in there. Now, Yeah, they could go find a sheet and they could cover it up, but by doing that, they're kind of like announcing to the world what's going on behind closed doors. It puts them in a very awkward, very uncomfortable situation. So it's kedai to be careful when it comes to that and deal with it in a proper way. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rabban should send Yeshua and voice parnasit should do to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Biaskel Tzedek, the Meher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.